Welcome back to Mr. Orr's Flipped Classroom. Today we're going to look at the research process in detail. This is intended for students not taking STEM Language Arts 9, but are still in STEM 9 and are completing this capstone. Please feel free to see me if you have questions or email them to me as well. First, remember the 4 questions about research. First question is, what do I want to know? That's your research question. Second question is, what data can answer that question? This relates to the data. How will I gather those data? That's the method. And what will I do with those data once I have them? That's analysis. That's breaking the research process down into 4 quick questions. At this point in time, you should already have created your research question, at least your main research question, in your science class. Now we need to talk about sub-questions. So you've already got that from Mr. Morandi's class. Right now you need to think about whether or not you need any additional or more concrete, more focused questions to be answered in order for you to resolve your main question. The answer is, of course you do. Let's do some examples of this and explain what we're talking about. First, take a generic research question looking at depression. So the general question is, are Metcalf students depressed? We need to revise this to be clear and more precise. So our next question might be, do teens at Metcalf perceive themselves as being depressed? Since we're not going to do any kind of clinical analysis, we need to look at what we can do. When we can ask students questions or your peers questions and have them respond to those, and those perceptions, how they report about themselves, could possibly give you the answer to your question for your particular study. So teens at Metcalf perceive themselves as being depressed. That's our main question. However, we need other questions to get at that item. So those might be, are teens at Metcalf aware of the signs and symptoms of depression? If they're going to call themselves depressed, do they actually know what it means? Do teens at Metcalf report feeling any of the signs and symptoms of depression? They may not necessarily label themselves as being depressed, but they might say certain characteristics are true about themselves. We might wonder if there's a relationship between gender and reporting signs or symptoms of depression. We might wonder if there's an age question as well. We might want to actually have a yes or no question of, do teens at Metcalf label themselves as depressed? Hypotheses. For our purposes, an hypothesis will be considered a directional restatement of the research question. Below are some examples of hypotheses for questions you've already seen. Notice how primarily we're just taking the subject and the verb and moving them around. We're trying to keep the exact same words whenever possible, such as, are teens at Metcalf aware of the signs and symptoms of depression? Hypothesis would be, teens at Metcalf are aware. Please note that when we're doing this, we're not trying to be fancy. We're simply trying to say yes or no, can you prove it? A hypothesis is a statement which you can prove or disprove based on the information you receive from the data you get in your study. It is not an opinion, it is not a prediction. In this sense, it's simply a statement. We have to be able to prove it or disprove it. A prediction, however, is going to be different for our purposes. Hypotheses are formally stated sentences which mirror the questions. Predictions, however, state more anecdotally, kind of like a story or more informally, what the researcher expects the data to show. An example below. Hypothesis 3 is, there is a relationship between gender and reported signs or symptoms of depression. Prediction 3 relates to that, that's why the numbers are the same. Females will report a higher frequency of signs and symptoms of depression than males. Perhaps you have some information in what you read in previous studies that indicate this. Perhaps it's simply your bias. Either way, our prediction is not just that there is a relationship, that we think that gender makes a difference. Our information, our data could come back and prove us wrong, that in fact there is no relationship between those two things. Make sure in hypotheses, predictions, all these, to avoid first and second person pronouns. No I, me, my, you, etc. For variables, just to quickly review the types of variables, we have control variables, which do not change and may not be particularly relevant to the question. They're going to be the same value no matter what, whether someone's participating or not participating. Independent variables. These are variables which are not changed by the experiment. Dependent variables. These are variables changed by the experiment or learned by the study. In other words, these represent the answers to the research questions. Value, as we're doing the term here, value is the quantity or label for a specific variable. Examples. So for the question is the relationship between age and reported signs or symptoms of depression. The independent variable here is going to be age. Age is not changed by the fact you asked the question. Age should be measured in years, and you might put actual chronological years down. Oftentimes we say age, we actually mean grade. So if we're going to measure age as far as grade 7, 8, 9, then we actually should change the word grade to grade level for all questions hypotheses to make sure we're being precise. The dependent variable here is reported signs or symptoms of depression. The value of that might be yes or no, but how are you going to measure this? How are you going to determine whether or not someone actually has reported signs or symptoms of depression? Is 1 going to be enough? Do they need to have at least 5? Is there other 10 values need to have at least 60%, 70%? How are you going to decide that? Or do we need to actually create several follow-up questions for each individual sign and symptom? It's more complicated than you think, especially if you have more than 1 or 2 or 3 possible responses. Assumptions. This is another important step in this process. Even before we get into the method, what are we already assuming? For example, if you're thinking you're going to do a questionnaire, then are you assuming that people are going to be willing to participate in the study? Are they going to actually complete the questionnaire? If they do, if you ask them questions, will they respond honestly and accurately? Will they hide things from you because they're embarrassed or upset, or the question's awkward, or they think it's all a joke? Have you assumed one way or the other? Are you assuming you're going to have access to the people you want to have completing this study or the survey? Are you assuming technology is going to cooperate? As we've learned, that's not something you can always assume. Or what technology or skill are you, or knowledge or skill are you assuming on the part of the participants? What should they know or know how to do? Are you assuming you get the help or permission you're going to need? All of these things we might take for granted, and therefore we need to write them down. We'll talk later about how to actually label these things in the document. But for now, try to go back through your main question and break it down with each of these steps: sub-questions, hypotheses, predictions, and assumptions. Seek help as you need it and bounce ideas off your peers, as well as checking the exemplars in Ms. Store's classroom. As always, good hunting.